In December 2021, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari signed not just the 2022 budget into law, but also the Finance Act 2021. Similar to its predecessors, the act proposed to amend 12 federal statutes in furtherance of the government's objectives to foster the growth of the economy, stimulate investment into Nigeria, and boost revenue generation. It appears that the act aims to close some loopholes in the country's tax laws, such as appointing the FIRS as the collecting agency of the Nigeria Police Trust Fund, as well as providing obtainable advantages to doing business in Nigeria. Nevertheless, the annual amendment to the tax laws has, to some analysts, made the tax regulations complex by creating a labyrinth of provisions. This will create a Herculean task for the FIRS as the agency required to implement these changes. These annual amendments also have an impact on taxpayers in the financial year. So let's see if we can bring a little clarity to the conversation today. Today we're looking at reviewing Nigeria's Amended Finance Act. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Joining me is Wale Ajayi, I beg your pardon. He's a partner in the Tax Regulatory and People Services practice of KPMG Advisory Services in Nigeria. Wale, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Tolu. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you as well. So let's start this conversation very quickly with the last point in my introduction, and that's the Nigerian taxpayer. When President Muhammadu Buhari signed into law the Finance Act of 2019, that revised certain redundant and anti-business provisions that existed in Nigeria's tax laws. He also signed the Finance Act of 2020 with commencement date from January the 1st, 2021, and has now also signed the Finance Act of 2021. So you're seeing 3 subsequent years of changes. What does this do, or what impact does this have on the Nigerian taxpayer who's trying to keep up with their tax regulations and make sure that they stay within the ambits of the law?
Oh, thank you so much, Tolulope. I think it's very important for us to understand why we need to have the Finance Act in the first place, right? The very last time we had this was in 1999 before Buhari came in, right? And that was Decree number 30 of 1999. And 20 years after, then we had the Finance Act 2019. And so what do they do? What do the Finance Acts do? 3 things in my mind. The very first one, of course, is to modernize our tax system, to ensure that our tax system reflects best practices. The number 2, of course, is to maximize domestic revenue. We need to generate domestic revenue. And we all agree with me is that we cannot continue to finance our budget, with borrowings. I mean, we just read reports that was released a couple of days ago that we're spending close to about 76%, of our revenue, to just service our debts. So that is not sustainable at all. So we need to maximize domestic revenue. And of course, the third thing is really to provide clarity, on some of the ambiguities in the tax law. Yes, they may appear complex because the changes are happening every year, but it's something that we're already used to, and I'm sure it's something that we get used to. I think at the end of the day, what matters is that our tax law reflects, modern provisions, and that they can help us to, maximize, the revenue from domestic market.
Particularly given your position, partner in the Tax Regulatory and People Services practice, what's sort of been the feedback from Nigerian taxpayers when it comes to the amendments? And as you said, it's sort of something we should get used to because we need to make up for the years in which we did not amend it. So what's been the feedback you're getting from taxpayers?
Okay, well, it's a mixed bag. Interestingly, last year there was no new tax that was introduced. But what the government has done this year is that we've had a mixture of we're trying to, widen the tax base and also, of course, trying to deepen the tax base. What I would say is that I think one thing that people are saying is the fact that the burden of tax is becoming unbearable, especially on taxpayers. Right. And yes, they do recognize the fact that we need to reduce our dependence on external borrowings. But there are a couple of things that I think are missing. I think the very first one is the fact that this government seems to have recognized the fact that it's probably much more difficult to address the issue of corruption, than to increase taxes, and which is what we're seeing. So there are multiple of taxes. There is a multiple of taxes that the government has introduced this year, right? And it's just increasing the tax burden on taxpayers. So that is one thing. And the other thing I would say that the government has also done is that, of course, we need to curb wasteful spending, right? I mean, we need to do that. We need to modernize our tax system in such a way that it will encourage voluntary compliance. So a lot of taxpayers, are worried, especially about the new taxes that are introduced, and the fact that education tax also has been increased, from 2% to 2.5%. So it's a mixed bag. But overall, when you look at what the government is doing, one thing is clear, of course, is that we need to increase tax to GDP ratio. I mean, that is basic, that is given. But the question is, how do we do it? Do you want to tax those people that are already compliant, or do you want to bring in as many people as possible into the tax net? I think that is the balance, delicate balance that the government needs to strike.
All right, and we'll talk about a delicate balance because there are concerns that this could also lead to either higher inflation or even job losses. So let's take a look at one of the more interesting amendments. This is Section 4 of the Act, which is taxation of e-commerce businesses owned by non-resident companies. Now, it sets that at 6%, and it empowers the FIRS to tax non-resident firms on their turnover and from the digital services provided to Nigerian customers. And so when we talk about this burden, we have a number of small and medium businesses that are doing business online. We even heard from Facebook, now Meta, at the end of last year that said they would charge VAT on adverts regardless of the purpose, whether it's for your professional services or personal reasons. The fear has been that this is just going to be passed down to the consumer, and it's the consumer, Nigerian consumer at this point, that's going to bear the burden of this tax. What do you think about that? Is that concern valid? Especially as you said, people are saying the burden is becoming too much.
Well, I don't think the concern is valid because, number one, two things. We need to separate those people that are non-resident, like the likes of Facebook, Amazon, and Apple that you talked about, or Nigerian companies that are doing business online. If you're doing business online, it shouldn't be different from the way you're taxed. It should not be different from the people that are doing business physically. So there's really no issue. But I think what matters is with respect to the international non-resident companies. Because at the end of the day, if you're not taxing them, if you're not paying taxes in Nigeria, what that means is that the income that we should have received in Nigeria is actually going to their own country. So people have to understand that, right? So what government has done is that we've recognized the fact that the current tax laws are not sufficient, to tax the digital economy. And so every country in the world is trying to find a way around about it. So every country in the world is facing a revenue challenge. And the question is, where will the revenue come from? And so you then have those companies really that are making a lot of money, right? The money is generated from Nigeria, since we're speaking about Nigeria, and they're not paying tax in Nigeria. The sentiment is the same. If you go to the UK, if you go to the Europe, unfortunately, these are all American companies. But the fact of the matter is that those taxes are due where the revenue is generated. So it's high time we did that. And of course, what the government has just done with 2021 is just to clarify that would apply, DIM tax, to the taxation, because the question is, how do you determine the profit they generate? Because they operate worldwide. So what the government has done is just to provide clarity on how that would operate.
But Wale, you have not answered my question. Who do you think is going to bear the burden to pay this tax? Will it not be passed back to the Nigerian customer?
Okay, so the question is, what tax are we even talking about in the first place, right? If you're talking about the Nigerian online, traders, obviously they will pay tax, whether it is online or it is physical. So you're basically talking about the likes of Amazon, Google, and what have you, right? And so the question then, of course, is, like I said, really, if you're not charging them, they're going to be paying tax anyway in their country. So it has not changed, right? So what has happened is that, of course, they will just put a VAT, on top of the income they earn in Nigeria. And so the Nigerian customer will bear that tax. So it's not going to be different. It's trying to bring in equity into the business. Because if you have a local company, providing services online, that business company, that online trader will charge VAT, and the Nigerian customers will pay the VAT. So all the government is trying to do is to bring in equity and fairness. Yes, so the burden will be on the Nigerian, customers. And so the question, of course, is, if you can't afford the tax, then you don't pay for the service, or you don't patronize them. It's as simple as that.
All right, makes some sense now. So again, you had mentioned earlier about this delicate balance, and of course, Nigeria working to improve its tax ratio, revenue to GDP as it is. But as you said, every country is struggling right now. COVID-19, we're still feeling the impact. There are still restrictions, travel restrictions as well. So there are those who believe that, is this really the time when you have a overburdened tax bracket or tax nets with the number of Nigerians who are paying, not as many as who should be paying actually. So the question here is there a possibility that certain tax requirements in the Act could in a way contribute to inflation or lead to job loss with companies who are trying to sort of compensate or cut costs in order to mate up? What burden or what unfortunate indirect or direct negative consequences could some of these changes have?
Well, I mean, I agree with you with respect to the timing of some of those levies and some of those taxes. But let me just kind of refresh the mind of our listeners. I mean, just 2 days ago, I think the Minister of Finance, announced that, with respect to the performance on the 2021 revenue projection, where we didn't make that projection by about 2 trillion, right? And in 2022, the proposed deficit, it's about 6 trillion, naira. And so the question is, where is that going to come from? We have to finance that deficit somehow, right? So the only other way is that we finance it from borrowings or finance it from tax. We're already spending about 76% of our revenue, to service debt. So that is not sustainable. Tax revenue is very predictable, right? If you go about it the right way, and that is how is by encouraging voluntary compliance. So I understand and I agree with you that some of those levies and taxes are not, the timing may not be now because then it will add to the inflationary, trend in Nigeria. But, at the end of the day is we need also to raise revenue, right, to meet the shortfall. But what I would have thought the government would have focused on would be, number one, we need to first, deal with the issue of corruption. I mean, like I've said in my opening, to me, it appears that government has given up, right? We can't be spending money wastefully. We can't be wasting our finance unnecessarily. And we need to look at incentives that we're currently given to people. We need to ask ourselves, are these incentives, tax incentives, are they effective? Are they even delivering value for us? What is the cost-benefit analysis of those incentives? Then number two, we've talked about subsidy. Just as at November last year, the government has spent close to about 1.2 trillion on subsidy. Of course, we call it under recovery. And so this is money that can be used, to provide capital infrastructure for Nigeria, but we're not doing that. And of course, we've tried to do tax amnesty. We didn't go about it the right way. And of course, because we're not enforcing the provisions of the law. So there are things that the government could have done, right? So, to improve, reduce the burden on Nigerian taxpayers, and then probably stagger when some of those taxes, are going to be introduced. I mean, you talk about the Axoni level. And
I apologize. Let me interrupt you here because we're going to pick up on that. And I'm happy you mentioned that because there's also the morality conversation sometimes with how can a government ask for citizens to bear more responsibility if they haven't done their own part. But there's also a bigger question. The Federal Inland Revenue Service has now expanded authority and responsibilities. We'll get into that when we come back from the break. You're watching Business Edge, and the conversation is on reviewing Nigeria's Finance Act 2021. The FIRS is one agency many in Nigeria do not play with. New responsibilities, expanded authority. What does that mean for the business climate? Stay with us. Still with me is Wale Ajayi, partner in the Tax, Regulatory and People Services practice of KPMG Advisory Service Nigeria. Now, the act we're talking about makes provisions for the FIRS and only the FIRS to be responsible for the administration, assessment, collection, accounting, and enforcement of taxes and levies due to the Federation, the federal government, and any of its agencies except otherwise authorized. This sum, people seem to think, addresses the issue where states are now seeking, I would say some states, are seeking to collect VAT on their own. But beyond that, Wale, let me bring you back in this. Is this the way to go? This expansion of the FIRS's powers and responsibilities, how do you feel about that, given how some people have raised concerns about the oversight and the ability to assess taxes, and we have 2 or 3 recent examples we can point to of how that has played out?
Okay, thank you. Let me correct an impression. It really has nothing to do with the VAT issue that the states want to collect. What that provision is meant to do is to reduce the issue of multiple audits. Taxpayers have been, complaining about the number of government agencies that have been coming to the office to disturb them about stamp duties, disturb them about VAT and some other taxes and other levies. So what this law or this provision of the law is saying is to make the FRS a primary agency. So in other words, if there is any issue with respect to tax, is the FRS, of course, I'm talking about federal taxes now, is the FRS that will be responsible, for the assessment, for the audit, of those taxes. And even if in their course of their work, they find out that is a taxpayer, that has not been paying taxes, that has been avoiding taxes, what they need to do is for them to recommend or to make a proposal to the FRS, and FRS will take it from there. You don't want to have a situation where you're facing with, we're dealing with FRS on one particular issue, on one tax audit. As that one has just been completed, the EFCC will come in, or RAMFAC will come in to say that they want to do their taxes. So all they're saying is that they're putting an end to that. So FRS will be the primary agency. But if in the course of the work, FRS determines that they need the assistance of any of those government agencies, then they can call them. So I think it's a very lovely provision, and I'm sure taxpayers will be happy about this particular provision.
All right. So the Act also establishes the Crisis Intervention Fund to cater for national emergencies. Now, all tiers of government are empowered to borrow for critical reforms of significant national impact, in addition to capital expenditure and human development. So a lot of questions about this have come up. What are the requirements for the states or for any level of government to access the funds? Do we have that? Where is the money that goes into this fund going to come from? There are questions as to if pension is a word that we should mention in this part. So Wale, clear this up for us.
Okay, I think the very first thing that we should talk about is the fact that I've just talked about how much we're spending on borrowing, to finance government projects. And of course, the focus of this government has always been, how to develop infrastructure. We know we need infrastructure in this country. Our roads are bad, our bridges are terrible. And of course, government introduced, a couple of years back, the road infrastructure, investment credit, to encourage public and private sector partnership. Right, so that's the whole essence of this. So, but what the government is trying to focus on is that, before any government, any tier of government, can embark on any project, it has to be a project that really will add value, to the community, right, in terms of capital projects. And it must be, even if you have to borrow, the interest rate has to be at a concessionary rate. And of course, this has to go through the National Assembly or through the House of Assembly, as the case may be, for approval. So where would the money come from? Well, obviously, in terms of setting up the fund, what will happen, I suspect, is that there will be a dedicated fund depending on the project. But I suspect at the end of the day, it's going to go by way of public-private sector partnership. Probably that is the best way, to go about it. But I think, this is where Nigerians or citizens really have to stand up, and make their government accountable. There's so many projects that so many governments have, have embarked on, and they will not finish. And so we have so many projects that are stranded, in Nigeria today. So it's just a law, just a provision in the law. At the end of the day, we need accountability. The law will not enforce itself. We then have to stand up. The civil rights organization, media houses have to stand up, and, ensure that government, in the right, every tier of government is spending money in the right way, and it's not just on wasteful projects.
All right, so Wale, let's talk about advantages, because overall it seems that, as you said, it took us almost 2 decades to get to the point where President Buhari signed the one in 2019. And of course, we're going to keep amending till we find what is as close to best for Nigeria. What advantages does the Act provide for small and medium businesses in particular, but in terms of the business environment in Nigeria as well? What are the positives we're looking at?
I think the first one that we did in 2019 was the one that was really targeted at the small and medium scale, because the government recognizes the fact that the engine of growth in Nigeria are the medium and small scale enterprises. And so what you then have is that, and it still continue, those incentives are still continuing, depending on your revenue. If your revenue is below 25 million, right, you're not paying taxes, right? And then, so that is what government is doing. And of course, there are also incentives that are provided, for if you're manufacturing and you're investing in a manufacturing setup, your dividend that you receive from those small manufacturing companies, you will not be paying returning tax on it, at least for the first 5 years, right? So there's so many, so the focus is on infrastructure. So, small and medium scale, to try and grow that business. And of course, if you're medium scale, that is, if you're earning revenue between 25 and 100 million, then your tax rate is lower, preferential rate of 20%, right? So what I see that the government is trying to do is to try to, as much as possible, encourage small scale, and at the same time try to raise revenue, for infrastructure. Because one of the things that the government has done in this particular act is that while they recognize the fact that we need to promote, small-scale businesses, what they've also done is that there is what is called tax allowances or capital allowances that they're supposed to get, right, to reduce, their taxable profit. But since they're not paying taxes, so what the government has done is that ordinarily they should have the ability to carry forward those tax allowances to the time when they will start paying taxes. But the government is saying, well, the period in which you're not paying taxes, those tax allowances will be deemed to have been consumed. So in other words, so they're trying to provide clarification that if you're not paying taxes, then you cannot enjoy the benefit of the expenses. The same thing they've done, with respect to income that is exempt. Any expense that is related to exempt income, right, will not be allowed for deduction. So that is what government is trying to do.
All right.
So it's just trying to strike a balance.
All right. So as we wrap up, I'm going to go back to basically where we started. And you mentioned, of course, at the beginning, the need for the Tax Act, for the amendment of the Finance Act, bringing us up to speed, modernizing, and of course, closing the loopholes. But also in the course of this conversation, we've talked about what else government can do, because the burden, let's be honest, is quite overwhelming. We didn't touch on it, but a lot of Nigerians have been reacting to the sugar tax. The excise duty now on carbonated and fizzy drinks that is taking off in Nigeria. So the question, of course, is about that balance. How does government strengthen its tax base, boost revenue, bring itself out of a COVID-19 sort of impact and fallout, but still not put too much burden on Nigerians? The value of the naira has reduced. Inflation is up. Food costs more. Everything literally costs more in the country right now. So how does that balance happen, Wale?
What I think the government needs to do, if you speak to any taxpayer, they will tell you that they are already, in Nigeria today, the level of tax saturation is extremely high. They're already overburdened because there are just so many taxes. As you're trying to grapple with one, the government is introducing another one. The next one that probably will come up will be the Tertiary Educational Development Trust, Tertiary Hospital Development Trust tax, right? And of course, there is also the one with the NYSC. And so the question is, people are asking, has government actually sat down, to ascertain, what the level of burden that taxpayers are bearing? Because if you have not sat down to do that calculations, then what you then continue to do is to introduce new taxes and burdening taxpayers that are already compliant. And what that does, of course, that has a consequence, is that people will become, not compliant, and there will be high level of tax evasion. So that has to be done. That review has to be done. And like I said, there are some other things, solutions that the government can look at, right? That without necessarily introducing new taxes or increasing the tax rate that people are already bearing. I talked about, the issue of, corruption. We need to tackle corruption. We need to look at the leakage in the system, because we're spending so much money and we're not seeing value. How is the money we're spending? How is it being accounted for, right? We need to plug the leakage. One easy way that we can do that is the subsidy. We need to take that out. 1.2 trillion in 11 months. That is a lot of money, right? The FAC was meant to have remitted up close to about, 1.2 trillion or thereabouts, 1.7 trillion to, the NNPC was meant to have remitted 1.8 or thereabout trillion, to FAC, but they only remit 1.5. The difference of 1.7, actually 1.2 of that is coming in from subsidy. So we need to plug that, leakage. That is extremely important. And of course, we need to take a look at our incentive scheme. We have so many tax incentives in Nigeria. A lot of them is focused on profits, tax exemption, tax holiday. We need to ask ourselves, how effective have they been? A lot of countries, that developed are focused on cost incentives, not profit incentives, whereby you compensate people for the investment they're making. So we need to look at that. But I think at the end of the day, government has to recognize that if they don't do anything, there is a consequence. And that consequence is that tax evasion will go up because they're already overburdening the taxpayers that are already compliant.
All right, Wale Ajayi, I know this conversation is not over, because we also really need to break down what is it that Nigerian taxpayers pay for almost on a daily basis, so we have a wider understanding. As you said, Nigerians need to stand up and ask for more accountability and transparency. So much. A great thank you for you joining me on the show today. We'll be talking to you very soon. And once again, Happy New Year.
Yeah, thanks, Tolulope.
All right.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Yeah. And a number of things that he listed in terms of how Nigeria could actually raise more money rather than raising taxes. But it's a conversation that will continue, because it has been a number of years since the country amended its Finance Act and its Tax Acts So, of course, in the next few years, we'll see how things settle. NC4 to watch is up next. And NC4 to watch is where we wrap things up. We start in Gabon, where the organized labor in the country, particularly in oil sector with water and electricity workers, union employees, have started a general strike in protest against COVID-19 restrictions and the cost of PCR tests. Burundi is banking on local tourism to restart the sector that has experienced a downturn following travel restrictions that kept tourists at bay. Now, this comes as the latest figures show that the country only received over 553,000 visitors in 2020, down from 2.6 million the previous year. Mali, which has raised more than $2 billion last year on the regional debt markets, was scheduled to sell T-bills on Wednesday, according to the website of Abidjan-based regional debt planning agency, UMA-Titris. Now, West Africa's main political bloc and its monetary union announced sanctions on Sunday over the interim authorities' failure to hold democratic elections next month, as agreed after a military coup in 2020. And finally, the World Bank is revising down its global forecast for 2022. The international lender has hinged the new review on the recent COVID-19 flare-ups, diminished policy support, and lingering supply chain bottlenecks. And that's Business Edge for today. Join us again, 11 a.m. West African time, where we put business, economic, and financial stories from across the continent front and center. I'll see you tomorrow.